Modal verbs of obligation and freedom in the past. In this lesson, you will learn about modal verbs of obligation in the past, how to use these past modal verbs correctly, and how to practice using modal verbs of obligation in the past. So let's look at some examples of rules in the past. In the times of Peter the Great in Russia, the noblemen weren't allowed to wear beards. If they wanted to keep their beards, they had to pay a special tax to the Tsar's government. Another example, in the 18th century England, people had to pay window tax for each window in their house. However, this law was eventually changed because poor people chose to live in houses without windows just so that they didn't have to pay. And now in America, in the 19th century, female teachers in the USA couldn't get married or even go out with men. If they got engaged, they had to resign from their job immediately. Male teachers, on the other hand, could get married and have children without any problem. So that's changed now, though, fortunately. And if you traveled in any motor vehicle in the 19th century Britain, the law said that someone had to walk in front of you waving a red flag at night time. So this meant in practice that you couldn't travel at more than 8 kilometers per hour. And in the Midwest of the USA in the 1880s, you were not allowed to eat ice cream sodas on Sunday. Restaurant owners solved this problem by serving ice cream without soda, which became known as a sundae or Sunday. Okay, so let's look at these modal verbs of obligation, the past forms. So can, that's the present, can becomes could, and can't, couldn't, or could not. Now we have have to. Have to becomes had to, and don't have to becomes didn't have to. Must becomes had to as well, and mustn't or must not becomes wasn't, weren't allowed to, or couldn't. So as you can see, there's no real form for must in the past. And now we have is or are allowed to. That becomes was, were allowed to. And isn't, aren't allowed to, wasn't, weren't allowed to. All right, now we have some more unusual laws from around the world. So I want you to complete the gaps with the past form of the modal verbs in parentheses. So question 1. In the 1920s in the USA, prohibition meant that you, so we have cannot. What is the past modal verb of cannot? Could not. So they could not produce or consume any alcoholic drinks. But eventually the government, so we have to in the past is had to. So they had to change this law. And firstly, because it was actually creating crime, and secondly, because people were drinking more alcohol than ever before. So that was not working. Let's look at number 2. In Italy in the 1930s, Italians, so we have aren't allowed, and that becomes weren't allowed to use foreign words. That's why Italian is one of the few languages that doesn't use the word football. Quite interesting. In Switzerland, women were not allowed to vote until 1971. In New Zealand, on the other hand, women, we have, so had the right to vote from 1893, making it the first country in the world to give women the right to vote. And number 4, 75 years ago, in Britain, anyone, we have can, so that becomes could, drive a car on the open road without taking a driving test. People don't have to, so that becomes didn't have to take a test until 1935, when the first practical road test was introduced. So from 1996, the test was changed, and learners, we have to, so again, had to take a theoretical test as well. And just some more things to think about to help you practice more using these modal verbs in the past. So let's think about, were your parents strict with you when you were a child? So how have things changed? Think about some rules. What rules did you have about the following? Homework, clothes, household chores. So what could you do? What couldn't you do? So just think about that, maybe talk with your friends about it and practice. So good work and good luck with your English.